left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. Finding life along the way, melodies we haven't played. No, I don't want no rest. Echoing around these walls, fighting to create a song. I don't wanna miss a beat. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, and on we'll go. And we'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon, turn us to thousands. And we'll grow in number, fueled by them to see the horizon.
Hey, how's everyone doing tonight? We are going to continue working on some of this NetCheck tool. I've definitely been slacking a little bit this week, been kind of busy and had some other priorities, so I haven't really made too much progress. But that's, the point of the stream is to, no matter what, we carry on. So, we're going to take a look at what we have in progress. And I did look through some documentation, and I do, have a pretty good idea of where we're going to go tonight. If you're new to the stream, welcome. Basically, what I'm working on is a web app completely built using Python, the Fast API web framework. So this is my kind of first bigger project where I'm trying to take hold of every aspect of it, from coding it all to writing the documentation to deploying it. So bear with me. And if you're here and and would like to chat, please feel free. I love whenever people are in the chat. So it's meant to be collaborative. If I didn't want it to be collaborative, I wouldn't stream it. So if you find something or you're thinking about something as we're streaming, or if you have questions, and it could be related to the project itself, it could be related to, like for example, we're using pyATS and Genie, the Python libraries. So if you have questions with that, I'll try to answer it to the best of my ability. But yeah, so let's go ahead and get started here. Randy, how are you doing? I see you in the chat. Glad you're here. Thanks for joining, Randy. So getting started, I want to first kind of go over my thoughts and where, kind of where we left off last time. Cause we did a lot of discussion last time and design work, I would say, just kind of thinking through things, brainstorming. So as you may or may not know, I guess, if you're new to the stream, basically I built this, or I'm building this tool. This is the tool itself, obviously still work in progress. But basically, it's being built to run validation or testing against your network. There's a lot of ways to do it. Specifically, I'm choosing to use the pyATS and Genie libraries. And obviously, there's more ways to do it using NetMiko, Nornir, just using the pyTest library, right? That's your standard testing library for Python, Scrapply. So it's definitely not a how-to. It's more or less just, hey, I wanted to learn more about it. And so I'm building a project around it. So just to quickly go over this page. So there's multiple pages here. And I don't have the server up. Hold on. I exited. All right, so I have the developer server up now. Homepage. So you'll be able to add inventory, right? This is a simple inventory we built. I think it's part 3, maybe. You have to check the video description. But basically, we have an inventory. You could search the inventory, right? So you see I'm searching for RT, SW. So you can dynamically search. Obviously, this is a lot of placeholder material or records. But you can add a device, plug in the host name and the IP address over here. It will go out. It will automatically discover the operating system. So like Cisco iOS, Cisco NXOS. It actually uses a feature of NetMiko called SSH Auto Detect. So it's a pretty cool feature if you haven't seen it, or module if you've never used it, but it's in the NetMiko library. Moving on from the inventory, and I guess the goal of the inventory, by the way, is not to just stop here, but basically create a framework to where if you're using another source of truth for your inventory, maybe it's a custom database, maybe it's like a netbox, we can integrate with that. That's down the line, way down the line. But I did want to provide some sort of simple inventory for this. Nick, hey Dan, apologies in advance, but I'm going to be away from the keyboard. Won't be able to chat too much until my pizza's done getting prepared. All good. Randy says, I don't see the screen. I'm not sure. That's weird. Okay. It does. If anyone else is in the chat, could they just let me know if they see the screen? Hopefully you can. I'm hoping you can. Yeah, you should be seeing, it's just a web browser for right now. Yeah. So yeah, hopefully Randy, you'll be able to see the screen soon. And if it really is a problem, or if other people are having the same problem, I'll take a look at OBS. But I'm looking at the live feed in YouTube, and it looks like the screen is there. So maybe you'll have to refresh the stream, Randy. Harshad says, comes up fine for me. Okay. Yeah, Randy, maybe close out of my stream and then reopen it. Sometimes, if you're on mobile, especially, the YouTube app, for whatever reason, sometimes scales the streams wrong. So maybe just try refreshing the stream. Hopefully that fixes it. Okay. So that's the simple inventory. Moving on, we have a validation tab. This is basically canned use cases. So simple tasks that a network engineer may be asked to do. So a circuit upgrade, a switch install. Obviously, so I will say this tool is not meant to replace you as far as doing the work. What this tool is meant to do is running checks, the much needed checks before and after. Most of the time after, especially for these two situations. Maybe with a circuit upgrade, you'll want to see if a BGP neighbor was up or there were these specific routes. But in this case, it will check CPU memory. It'll check the number of BGP neighbors. In this case, because it's canned, it's statically set to at least a minimum of 2 established eBGP neighbors. It will ping a device, and then it will check logs for a severity level of 3 or error, or higher, so 3, 2, 1. I know it sounds backwards when I say it, but so it'll do that. And then basically the same thing on the switch side. It'll verify iOS version, interface errors, logging, and then the basics. So those are the canned use test cases. And then we have this custom validation page, which is something I've been working on now for probably the past 3 or 4 streams. It's been most of the streams up to this point. Basically, instead of having those canned validation test cases, you'll be able to type in the name of a test. So maybe something that's important to you. So like HQ cutover, right? Something like that. And then we'll basically have a bank of tests that you can run and drag over. Basically, it's like a la carte, right? You can kind of pick what you want. And then the goal is to have some additional arrows or more data that you can fill in underneath of each one of these boxes. So like, for example, environment, maybe we'll have a box that says desired CPU utilization, desired memory, and you plug all that stuff in. So that would be example for environment. For BGP, you would have, number of BGP neighbors. You would say maybe number of routes learned via BGP, right? And then same with OSPF, you could do whatever. So I'm basically trying to work out how we're going to do that before we figure out, okay, like for example, like I'm not a front end dev, so figuring out like how to add those extra boxes and stuff is like already a task that's outside of my realm. But what I am trying to figure out is the back end. What I'm used to, the Python side of it, which is how do I dynamically create these test cases or create one test run with all these test cases and be dynamic, right? So I think I have an idea, and we're going to try to we're basically going to try to work through that tonight. We'll see how far we get with it, right? So, and just to show you, you could delete test cases from the right side. So I did reload the app and already I watch. Okay, Randy. Hopefully it sounds like that may have fixed it. If it didn't, I'm not sure what to tell you. Maybe close out of YouTube again. So hopefully that works. All right. And that's about it. We have an analysis section, which is obviously it's not working. And then we have a results tab. The results tab, I do plan to work on down the line because right now it's very bare bones. It tells you the success rate of the test, the total number of tests, but it doesn't give you really much info besides that. So I'm thinking about adding some sort of hyperlink to the name right here. So when you click on that, it will produce or download the raw log file for you. So that way you could say, okay, I remember executing this test, but why is it only a 50% success rate, right? And then you could download the logs. So that's the tool. We're gonna, like I said, be working on the custom validation page tonight. But before I do that, I wanted to go over at a high level a quick pyATS 101. And I'm not going to try to spend too much time, but I do like to level set because everyone that's watching may vary in their experience with pyATS, and since it is such a big library with it's batteries included for sure, right? It has a lot of little features, so I want to try to cover what we plan to use and kind of how it runs as it pertains to this specific use case, right? Because there's going to be plenty of ways we can run this, but I want it to be just very concentrated on just this project, right? So there's two. So before we get, so pyATS is a testing framework built for testing your infrastructure, right? Let me try to show you. So if you're familiar with PyTest, and this is kind of like, there's an assumption that you have some Python experience when I'm saying this. If you're familiar with the PyTest library, which is a testing framework, pretty much the standard now. They used to have unit tests. I mean, they still use unit tests, but PyTest is kind of that standard for testing framework. pyATS basically takes a lot of concepts from that, and at least the structure, and uses that as its kind of jump off point. And so it uses the concept of this AE test harness, and that's kind of like the standard component, as it says, the standard component. It's kind of that base. So you'll see that here's a very simple use case. So, and what I'm trying to do is kind of explain it not from a programmatic standpoint, but kind of to what a network engineer may view it, and hopefully it connects with you. If you, like I said, if you have any questions, please feel free to put it in the chat. And if you're watching this as like a rerun, please feel free to reach out to me. I like to try to explain this in a way that someone with minimal or maybe no automation experience can kind of take this information in and be like, okay, that makes sense of why we would automate that, right? So there's 3 sections in this. This is a test script, right? And so there's 3 main sections, right? There's a common setup, there's the test case itself, and a cleanup. So whenever you're doing testing, there's an expectation that whatever you decide to, let's say you want to test to make sure if I shut down a BGP neighbor, that routing still works in a specific way, right? I won't get into a specific example, but you can kind of see where I'm going, right? You configure something, in this case, shutting down a BGP neighbor, removing it, and then you expect X amount of routes to be available in the routing table, or this route to be present still for failover purposes or whatnot. So, all of that you can do within a test case. You can configure, you can run show commands, you can parse output, you can say, is this equal to this? Is this less than that? But at the end of the day, as with all good testing or in test cases, you should try to reset the infrastructure back to the way it was, right? Whether it's a lab environment, I hope it's not prod, but I get it. Some people may not have a lab environment. But so, that's what each of these sections are for. And the first one, the common setup, is for most of the just kind of laying the foundation, right? So we're most of the time connecting to the devices. If there's kind of just the minimal just setup. Most of the time, in my experience, I've only really connected to the devices and validated that, hey, pyATS is connected to the devices. You can do other things, though. You can do ping tests. You can do things to say, before we start getting crazy and deleting things, configuring things, let's just do a couple checks, right? You could maybe check the routes available before you shut down the BGP neighbor. And then once that's set, right? Once we know kind of where we're at with that, then we jump into the test case, right? The test case is where you actually do your configuration. This is where you break stuff, right? You can configure things. You can do your checks. Some of the checks I talked about in the common setup may not be needed for this common setup. It could just be needed for just that test case, so we would put it under the test case. So you do all your testing, you break things, whatever you need to do. The common cleanup is exactly what it says. The cleanup literally cleans up the environment, right? So let's re-enable that neighbor. Let's maybe validate that route is coming from that neighbor, the one that you were expecting to be fail over or whatever. So that's kind of the 3 main sections. And there doesn't just have to be 3. The 2 that are absolutely mandatory are common setup and common cleanup. Setup and cleanup are mandatory for the obvious reason that there should always be a kind of a setup or a way to create that foundation to do your testing, and then the cleanup should reset your environment back to the way it was before you messed things up. You did your chaos testing with your test cases. So that's kind of a high level of where pyATS, or what it is. It basically, pyATS is that framework of common setup, test cases, and common cleanup. And you see some other things in here like AE test subsection, AE test.test, these decorators here. There's plenty, like I said, there's plenty more to dive into, but I think a simple example of what I just went through, I hope kind of hits home for you and makes, helps you understand kind of what all this means and why we're doing it. Hey, Network Bits, good to see you again. Keep up the good work. Thank you for coming by the stream. I appreciate it. Like I said, if you have questions about any of this, I would, and we don't have to talk on stream. If you want to message me on the side, hit me up on Twitter or whatever, I'd be glad. I love talking about this stuff. It doesn't have to be pyATS, but just network automation, the different libraries available. I like to figure things out. So yeah, please feel free to let me know if you have any questions about it. So let me see. Here we go. Perfect. Okay, so for those that are visual learners like me, this helped me a lot. And so you will see the 3 different sections. And like I said, this second isn't really a section. It's kind of you can have multiple test cases, right? So in that example, you saw common setup, test case, simple test case or something like that, and then common cleanup. But you can have common setup, test case 1, test case 2, test case 3, common cleanup. But I think this is a good example, right? You can see there's different subsections within the common setup and the common cleanup. And then within the test cases, you can see we do a setup, we do test 1, test 2, test 3, so on. And then you can do a setup and a cleanup within a test case as well. So let's say you have 3 different test cases, and you can do a setup and cleanup within each test case. But the common setup, all you want to do is connect to the device, because no matter what, you're going to connect to that device, and then you'll run all the different test cases that basically will take care of themselves, right? They're like self-maintained, if that makes sense. So that is an option as well. And you can read through all this. That's, like I said, it has plenty of documentation available. Really good stuff. It's a lot. So that's why I try to keep it, as high level here. So we're going to jump down to running the test scripts, because this is what we're actually going to be covering tonight. Hey, Nick. Glad to see you back. So there's 2 different ways to run these test scripts. You have standalone and then through EasyPy. So you're probably like, okay, I'm just trying to learn how to run a Python script, right? Like if you're just starting out, you're used to just running Python and then the name of the script. So pyATS allows you to run your test scripts 2 different ways. So there's the standalone and then EasyPy. Basically what EasyPy allows you to do is, we took a look at an example test script. So here's a test script, right? It has the common setup. Let's say there's 3 test cases in the common cleanup. That's one test script, right? This is one big test script. EasyPy allows you to run multiple test scripts through what's called a job file. And we're going to take a look at this. So if you're confused, that's okay. We're taking a look at it. And so that's very convenient, because we can run multiple test scripts. Whereas standalone, you run just one test script directly. So it's very direct. All the output and all the logging is right to your standard output, so in your terminal. Whereas EasyPy has a way to, it archives, it has like a reporting feature, it has some log archiving. It's very more put together, if that makes sense. And allows you to really, it's more, as it says, production ready. And like it says here, best suited for sanity and regression testing, versus where this standalone mode is just for, hey, I want to run this test script, and I'm okay with all the logging being in the standard output or in the terminal, right? If you're doing network config changes, does it make sense to do a diff on before and after comparisons? Is there a way to ignore the recently added config? Hope this makes sense. Yeah, so Nick's asking probably a common question you guys are all thinking about, where, all I'm doing is making a config change. Can I just do a diff? Well, let me pull up. So, and I'll just show you real quickly here. Genie docs. So I'm sure if you've heard of pyATS, you've heard of Genie. It's kind of like its companion library. Genie has a lot of great features as well. But there's this really cool, let me pull it up here. I think it's called useful libraries. Useful libraries, here you go. So you can actually run a diff. Let me see if it finds it here. So you could diff the output. Now what this does a diff to though is you could technically you could diff two dictionaries, so it doesn't have to be like output, like parsed output from a config or state data, but you could do a diff on two different outputs. But as far as, let me see, your question was if you're doing network config changes, does it make sense to do a diff before and after? Okay, so now I think I get your question. Sorry, I read over the config changes part. So I think it probably would be better, instead of doing a diff, you would do a diff on the operational state, I think is probably the way to do it. So that way, let's say you change routing config, obviously you're going to lose a neighbor. And the only way to view that, depending on the routing protocol, right, is, you name the CLI command to look at the different neighbors for the routing protocols. So you would run those commands. You would parse the output through a Genie parser, which that is available here. There's available parsers. So you run that through a parser, and then what you do is take the different outputs, and then you do a diff against them using this library. And what prints out is, let me see if there's a cleaner, it looks like down here, is basically what you, like a git you would see in diff, or I'm sorry, a diff you would see in git, where it basically would say, okay, here's the difference between the two. This was added, this was removed between your two diffs. So you could do something like that, Nick. I think that might be your best thing. That might be the best way to do it. Hopefully it answers your question. But yeah, to summarize, checking the operational state will probably be your best bet. All right. So we're talking about running the test scripts. So through EasyPy is the way we're doing it. Purpose being is we want to do sanity and regression testing at some point. Right now we're just running a test. We're saving the results to a database, but what if we want to save those archive files and then do a diff later, right? Or let's say we want to, a diff I think would be a comparison, right? So we're not doing standalone mode. We're using EasyPy. But if you're interested in like, hey, I'm just getting my feet wet, then I would say try standalone mode, because I think it's pretty easy to get started. I mean, both are very easy to get started, but standalone mode takes like one less thing out of the equation because it doesn't use its job files. And here's how to use standalone mode. It's pretty straightforward. So we'll scroll down. That's more standalone mode. You can see what the results will look like in your terminal if you ran it. This is where you would run Python and then the name of your script. And then you'd have each of these sections here. The detailed test results and then the summary. And this, like I said, this is all like pretty printed into your terminal. So you could capture these results if you want, but this is a good place to get started. All right, let's go to, now that you guys, like I said, I'm kind of just blowing through all this right now. I showed you what a test script looks like, how to run different test scripts through EasyPy and through the standalone execution. So let's jump to the EasyPy here. do introductions. No, we don't need that. Right, so basically when you want to run EasyPy, you can use a CLI interface, a CLI command of pyATS run job, and then you put the name of the job file, right? And so let me get down to, actually what I'll do is I could show you sorry, I'm just reading through this. I could show you what we're doing in the NetCheck tool here. So to run a pyATS job, and I'll turn this up one. I'll zoom it in because I know it can be tough to read on stream. So we use this run pyATS job function a lot through the tool. Basically, you give it a job file name and then the current directory. And what I do is I run the sub process, and basically it just creates a process and runs the job within this, within the process. And I literally feed it pyATS run job, the name of the job file, right? And then I have some extra flags that I basically say, okay, don't do subdirectories in your no archive subdirectories. I basically state where to place the archive directory, and then I assign it an archive name. And most of the time, this archive name is just, I was gonna say it's just the date and time, and the purpose of that is just to keep it unique for now. Obviously, I know when there's multiple users on it and you're both running archive or running a test job, then it could be different. But the way I have it down, I believe, is by milliseconds, if I remember correctly. So, but anyways, so that's how the job files are ran. To show you what a job file may look like, this is it. And if you read through the documentation, you'll see they tell you to put create one kind of main function with the runtime parameter or argument, and then all you do is basically use run, put the name of the test script that you want to run, the runtime environment, and then a testbed file. And like I said, you could, if you wanted to, run multiple test scripts. So I can put, line 11, I could say run test script circuit upgrade and then switch install. And then below that I could do layer 2 checks. And that way all of those test scripts will run in one job. And at the end of the day, the one job will have all the results for every test script. So that way everything stays, together. I'll have to trust you and look at the replay. I was running to the oven to preheat the dough. All good, Nick. Let's see, okay. And just to show you an example, I thought behavior and flow. So it explains what like runtime. I talked about passing in runtime as an argument. It explains some things you can pull from runtime. You can pull specific environment attributes. You can pull the archive, the job name, job file, the test bed. But here's let me see. So here is the run info folder, and it contains all the logs for the job file and all the tasks, right? So basically, and this is kind of where I brought up this whiteboard, right? So let's start with, and I'm really bad with drawing, but oh gosh, no, we're just gonna start over. That was trash. Let's try that again. All right, so we have a job. So we have a job, right? And let's say we have, I'm just gonna put TS for test script. So let's say we have like 3 test scripts, right? And I'll kind of show you, I guess I'll walk through my thought of where or how we're going to organize this. So we have a job, 3 different test scripts, and I already actually created the test scripts here. We'll call it environment, routing BGP, and routing OSPF. So we'll call this one, actually, I'm not even going to try. I'm going to just type this out. So we're going to say this one's environment. Is there a way to increase the font? Large. There we go. So we have environment, and then we have routing BGP. And the reason I put routing first is for kind of organizational purposes. So if you want something related to routing, you're gonna, that's the name, the naming convention hopefully helps that. Right? So my thought is anytime, and we'll call this one custom job file. Right? So I'm thinking anytime that we want to run a custom job, so like here, right, each of these boxes will be individual test scripts, right? Now the only thing that we need to add, and this is kind of, you know, where I'm going with this, is how do we feed in these extra parameters, right? Because me telling you, okay, you want to check BGP routing? Okay, cool. We'll just run the test and trust me, it'll be fine, right? That's not going to work. So you're going to want to be able to specify, like for BGP, number of neighbors, number of routes, maybe something about the actual BGP process on the router, and then environment, you know, CPU utilization percentage, memory percentage, power, like all these little things that we can dive into. So how do we get those values into our test script, right? Because in our test script, we can easily say if CPU percent is greater, you know, if captured CPU percent is greater than expected CPU percent, fail, right? Because that's basically, you know, it would fail our test. So I can easily do that. But how am I going to pass those values in? Like, what is our expected CPU percent? Did I say CPU temp? I meant CPU percentage. CPU percentage, right? So how do I pass that in? So moving through this, and going back to the test scripts, right? Because I'll go back to this to remind you what a test script is. Common setup, test cases, common cleanup, and you can run multiple test scripts in a job file, right? Going back to here, we have the custom, we have the job file, and each of these are individual test scripts. So there's 3 total. You can feed in, so to each of these individual test scripts, you can feed in what's called a data file. And a data file basically allows you to dynamically manipulate the arguments that are fed into the test script. And I'll show you that in just a second here. I saw a couple things pop in here. Does the more data field need to have and can accept a JSON string? No, so Harshad, and this is probably what's confusing about it. I'm not a front-end developer, you know, by heart. And it's grown on me, but I don't really love it. But basically what I need to do is, instead of saying more data right here, I basically have to create multiple, like, label text box. And just imagine this box being like, call it 4 or 5 of these more data and text box fields, and each one will say like expected CPU percentage, expected memory percentage, right? So it's not necessarily like feed in a bunch of data. I'm sorry, the label's very misleading, but I got some work to do on the front end form here. Hopefully that clears that up, Harshad. Add checkboxes or write in attributes or other data you might want to capture. Do you want to presume what the tester wants to get data for? Yeah, so that's a whole other thing, Nick. Because you got to put control. You have to put some sort of boundaries on it. Otherwise, you'll be writing your own test script. But yeah, I do plan to basically say like number of neighbors, using BGP as an example, right? Number of established neighbors, number of eBGP routes, number of IBGP routes, maybe. Honestly, it's up for whatever. A lot of times it's like, especially, routing specifically, I'm sure there's people in the service provider world that would like to see specific things versus someone in the enterprise space, right? So it's just, we got to figure out what is that common set of parameters that we should ask. And then the nice part is we can add to it. Like, that's not a problem. Because believe it or not, a lot of this data, I just rambled off like 3 or 4 different things. A lot of this data you can get from 1 or 2 show commands, right? So I think that's the cool part about it, is there's a lot of data within this output, especially some of the lengthy output. But yeah, we can add to it. But yeah, if I basically was saying, I understand, I'm just thinking what's important to me may not necessarily be important to someone else. Yeah, totally, Nick. I agree with you. The problem is, if I took everyone's opinion, then we wouldn't really have a tool, if that makes sense, right? Because then I would try to, like I said, I'm going to try to build out as much as I can to as a common use case. And then from, that's kind of in my head too as well. Like, how do I build out a ecosystem to where someone, let's say you have something specific, Nick, that you want, I can add in something to say, okay, well, you could develop this, that specific check you want to make, right? So that's kind of the beauty of it being open source as well, right? So people can contribute to it. Like, going back to the service provider example, someone can just say, hey, I work for a service provider, and this would be really cool to see. Okay, cool. Add it in. I just have to be able to create that foundation for you to add it and make it very easy. Time for a Twitter poll. Yeah. Harshad says, what are we testing the data against? Maybe you can get the expected fields from that data source or or source of truth and dynamically create those HTML fields. That's a good solution, Harshad. So get the expected fields from that data source or source of truth and dynamically create those HTML fields. So I guess that, Harshad, there'd be an expectation there that this is documented somewhere in a way that this tool can pull from that data source, right? So, like, it kind of goes to, it's a buzzword these days, but basically the intent-based networking. You're almost putting your intent to say, hey, I don't expect, this, or this. And the thing is, it probably depends per device, right? So, like, you might have a core router that has X amount of routes, but, like, you might have, another router in your network that wouldn't have as many, right? It's tough. That's why I said it's almost as if we need to start here, start somewhere basic to where you can plug in a host name, you can plug in all the expectations you have for that specific device and let it rip. And if the test comes back, you'll know exactly what it tested for. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm starting though, is somewhere in that, like, in between, where it's easy enough for a junior to pick it up, right, to where they could use it, but hopefully we can keep it as dynamic enough for a senior engineer to, test the nerd knobs per se, right? That's hopefully where I'm getting at. And like I said, whatever we build today or this year may not be the same in a year from now, right? There's plenty of big projects out there that have changed over time. So, yeah. But for now, we're gonna build specific tests with expecting specific parameters, right? And you're gonna feed that into the tool, which then will take all the data that you input and generate those test results for you and spit it back out in this web app that you download the results, and you can quickly view the results in the results tab. So yeah, has it been built before? Maybe. I'm sure someone somewhere has built something like this, and there's something that exists already. But this is really, something that I really enjoy doing, and I hope those watching think it's just as cool and hopefully learn along the way, because there's a lot that's going on here, right? There's the front end, there's the pyATS framework that I'm going over, there's the API side, with Fast API. Yeah, it's just a lot. And plus, database backend. So there's a lot to cover, and I'm learning a lot as we go along. So, I hope, those that are watching, you guys are enjoying it as well, and hopefully learning a little bit, no matter how the tool turns out. So, anyways, back to our example here. So we have a job with 3 different test scripts, and the way that they're ran, and I didn't highlight this, but I want to real quickly. So during runtime, these test scripts are launched as tasks and executed through the AE test harness. Each task is its own child process. The combined tasks in the same job file always share the same system resources, such as test beds, devices, and their connections, right? So basically, something you mess up in, call it test script 1. Let's say you break something. You shut down a port and it breaks BGP. That's going to be affected, unless you clean it up, that's going to be affected in your second test script and your third, right? So that's what they mean by shared resources. But I just wanted to highlight that because, they're all encapsulated in their own child process. So it's not like you're not using, async IO or anything like that. They're in their own process. It's, multi-processing essentially. And so I guess it may not be the correct word, but they're spun up in their own process. That's what I meant. So anyways, those dynamic arguments that we were talking about, the parameters, right? That more data, that's the placeholder for now. How are we going to feed those into the individual test scripts? Well, that's where a data file comes in. So the data file, you can see here, it's a YAML-based file. It allows dynamic updates and overwrites to the current test script module. It's an optional augmentation for the regular script runs and allows users to easily change script values and various features without modifying the original script. So basically, it just feeds in parameters for you. Okay. The contents can update the script's module and classes directly after the script is imported and before execution starts. Only modules and class levels may be provided via the data file. So common setup, test cases, common cleanup. We've already talked about that. Function-based sections are not affected. So you have to feed in the parameters or these dynamic arguments through common setup, the test case, or the common cleanup. And the way you do that is creating a YAML file. Only a single data file can be provided. However, each data file may extend to one or more data files, creating a chaining relationship. When a data file extends another data file, the other data file forms the basis, right? So let's say you call param A in the base data file and you extend to data file B, then data file B can overwrite that param A if it's stated again. So that's all it's saying is there's kind of rules to the game in that way. Test parameters are the various parameters block, and it's updated into corresponding sections base parameters. So there's a like overarching, like, think of it, global parameters, right? They show you the schema. There's a lot here. I don't want to overwhelm you with it. Here's a good example, though, of a data file. So you have your parameters here, and you basically, they're just key value pairs, right? And let me try to zoom in a little bit. There we go. Hopefully that's easier to read. So you have your parameters here. Processors, I've never really used them too much. I've read about them, but I haven't used them. So we'll skip over those. And then test cases, you have your the name of your test case, right? So in our case, it's called what? Environment and routing BGP, routing OSPF. So we'll call, sorry, now I'm losing. Okay, there we go. So environment, we'll call this one environment, this one called routing BGP. You can call it a different, create a different ID for it. You can assign it a group. You can, and then you feed in the parameters. So I find this one to be interesting because this is kind of just like what I would be looking for. So for my test case 1 here, there's a key of expected routes and a value of an integer of 35, right? So we can kind of do the same thing for our different routing ones. Like if that's a argument or a parameter that we want from the user, this is one way to feed it in, right? And almost to a T. So I think it's kind of a cool example. So the way that this gets added is using, let me show you. So basically it's just added as a flag, right? So you create the YAML file that we just went over, and then we add it in as with the data file flag, and then we that's basically what allows you to have those custom values, right? Going back to, I believe Nick mentioned it, where you can kind of feed in these custom arguments, custom values that may not be important to you, right? So if there's some values that aren't important to you, maybe there's a way we could say, you know what, don't worry about it. We don't want to test it. But, number of routes, for example, will definitely be different for a service provider versus maybe an enterprise. Nick says a tool I would really like is being able to stress test the circuit to verify a QoS policy that's actually doing what it's intended. I think there's plenty of those out there. I want to say, it's not T-Rex. Does that sound familiar? T-Rex. It's I don't know if it tests Cisco T-Rex. Yeah, it's a traffic generator. But yeah, I believe support for emulating layer 7 traffic with fully featured scalable TCP UDP support. I don't know the ins and outs, Nick, but I think T-Rex might be able to help you out. I also know of another tool called Spirent. Spirent, I guess communications. This is another cool tool as well. Wait, let me make sure I'm not lying to you. Well, I know Spirent is a tool for testing. Testing. QoS testing, here we go. Anyways. Spirant.com. It doesn't sound, well, maybe it is. There you go. All right, so I'll put both of these in the chat for you. Probably don't need, probably just Spirant.com will work. So yeah, Nick, I'll put both these in the chat for you. T-Rex, I'm not as familiar with. I haven't really, but based on what I'm seeing, and actually I have watched a demo on YouTube, and I think QoS you can validate it as well. So maybe check out T-Rex first, and then like I said, Spirant might be a good yeah, Spirant might be a good follow-up to that as well. All right. Where was I? Shoot. Oh yeah, data file inputs, right? So we pass all them in, and that's how we get that custom data. And we could validate, or we could say, all right, for these specific test cases, we want this data in it, right? We want these parameters identified. And so that's kind of where, you know what? I'm just going to stick with this look here. The typing, because I can't draw at all. So we'll just say data files for that, and we'll call it red. Custom args. Oh, I broke it. All right, there we go. All right, so the custom args are coming from the data file. I don't like the way that looks. All right, anyways, you kind of get where I'm going with that, right? So you have a data file that's attached here, you have a data file attached here, you have a data file attached here, right? So no matter what, you can have different data files for each test script, right? So we have kind of a lot here, right? We have a job file, and then we have individual test scripts with individual data files that feed in the different parameters into the test script. I was trying to go through some code today to try to figure out the best way to dynamically load these test scripts into a job file. That's still TBD. I thought I had an idea, and I tried it out, and it didn't work as intended. But this is kind of, hopefully you see the different levels of customization here, right? So we can create this custom job file, and we basically take these the names of these test scripts in from the front end, from the user, and then we feed it into this job file, and then we create a data file from all those other extra parameters that we need to get from the front end. So it's a lot of user input, but you know, we'll control it in the best ways we can through input validation, drop downs, you know, make something, if it can be something that can be selected, for example, like a number, I'll do one of those like number drop downs, or what are they called? You know, where you can kind of assign a number versus like being able to type anything into the box, do something like that. So this is kind of my plan here. It might be cool to integrate into your testing and validation. Do you mean the T-Rex tool? Nick? Emerson says ostinato. Actually, I feel like I've heard of that. Let me look it up. Ostinato network generator. Traffic generator for network engineers. QoS right here. So I'll put this one in there as well. Wireshark in reverse. Dude, I love that. I think Wireshark in reverse and the perfect companion tool to Wireshark. So yeah, I'll toss Ostinato in here as well. Yeah. Oh, so you do want me to put T-Rex, just float T-Rex in here as well? That's what you're saying, Nick? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I'm just trying to listen. I'm just trying to get pyATS to work in here, and once I get that foundation, maybe build on it. But I'm just trying to get some basic stuff to start working. How far are you willing to go with validation and testing? Address FAMs testing, multicast VPNs. Honestly, if there's a valid use case for it, and like someone can give me particulars on something specific, then I would build it, so. But yeah, I've stuck with the basics, and these 3 that are in there now aren't the 3 that are like permanent. I'll add to them. I'm like I said, I'm just trying to figure out the best way to, once I figure out how to like dynamically run these test cases, building the test cases will be a little easier. And I'm actually going to build one of the test cases and kind of show you kind of the process with that. I already have some of it wrote out, and that's from the static tests, the CAN tests. But yeah, we'll take a look at one actually right now, because I think I'm done with this part. So one job file, and then dynamically we will figure out what test cases or test scripts to run, and then we'll feed in data files into the individual test scripts, because it'll depend on the user. So that's the thing too, right? All this is dynamic. The test scripts, which test script to run is dynamic, because remember, the user can select which test script to run, right? I can say, I actually only want to check BGP. I don't want to check environment, right? So this first area column is dynamic. And then once we figure out what test script to run, then we have to feed in a data file into that test script. So I got to figure out a good way to organize that. This is the part where I kind of have to just try different ways, through code. But like at a high level, this kind of makes sense to me. But this isn't final design. This would be the ideal design, but we'll see what's possible once like I said, I've started testing a little bit earlier this evening, but we'll see what we can do. Future feature, perhaps. I hear you. Yeah. Like I said, that's the beauty of it, Nick, is once we get this foundation down of how to actually run everything, adding to it should be very easy, to the point where anyone can open up a pull request and be able to contribute to the tool, right? Because it's out there for everyone to take a look at, to tell me what we could do better. So going off of that logic, right? I need to be able to... What I was hoping was... I'll just try to pull something up real quick. I'll pull up what we get from the front end, so that way you can see it. Let me see. Is it here? Okay, maybe not. I'll just regenerate it. Alright, so we'll just throw in all these, right? So we'll run the test. It says test is started. Nothing actually runs, so don't worry. because the reason it errors out on the back end is because we don't have Redis stood up. And so basically when we spin up or run a test, it kicks off in a background task using RQ or Redis queue. But I can show you what we get from the front end. And this is where like my lack of front end skills comes into play. So I literally just do, using Ajax, send this to the back end. And I'll just show it to you just so that way you can see it. Basically, it comes to be a Python dictionary with two keys, test name and test. The test name is just, if you specify a test name, it will be there will be a test name. If there's not, it's just a bunch of random, it's just a random string. Or random UID, basically, UUID. And then there's the test key, which is a list of the tests, right? And these are literally the values of the buttons that you see on the front end, right? So you can see like environment shows parentheses, CPU, memory, etc. You can see it's here as well, right? So I'm basically sending in the data from, it's kind of like a form, but because we're using like buttons and because technically these are buttons right here, that's why I keep saying that, like these, what I keep dragging, I basically take in, when I press run test, I find whatever's in this box and I extract out the value of I forget whether it's I forget what it, I think it's also a button. I extract out this value, and then my plan is to extract out these other values and make a nested dictionary. So that way you'll have test, the name of the test, and then a dictionary of all of the additional parameters. And so we have our data that we get from the front end. What I think I need to do is either take this data, write it to the database, right? And then retrieve that data from the database in the job file to pull out all the different tests that are ran. And then from there, I can figure out what test scripts to run, right? Because then I can figure out, okay, run test script BGP routing, run test script environment, run test script OSPF routing. But then I've thought, okay, that's a lot of database reading and writing, right? Because every time you run a test, you're reading and writing at least 3-4 times to the database, because you're writing this output, obviously not directly, but in some form. You're creating a record, you're then reading the record from the job file, running the tests, and then writing back to the database, writing the results back to the database. So there's that I could do, or probably what I'll do is use something like Redis, that's an in-memory data store, right? It's things that I don't necessarily need to read and write from a database. I just need quick access between two different sources, right? One will take it from a front end, write it to that key value data store in Redis, and then I can pull it from that in this file. I've never really messed too much with Redis outside of creating background tasks, but I think theoretically it could be possible. I just gotta figure out how to do it. Sounds like a good way to implement lazy loading. As you drag a test to the window, it loads the nested data file to be tested. Is this what you mean or no? No. That's interesting, though. That's an interesting way to put it. No, so it loads the nested data file to be tested. So the only way this gets tested is if I click run test. But from what I'm reading, Nick, of what you said is all of this data gets sent or gets moved from, like, what you're saying is when you drag over BGP routing, if you drag a test to the window, it loads the nest. You're saying it loads the file here. So I don't have any of the parameters filled out yet. And no, we're not loading the data file yet. So my plan is we'll have all of the data in these boxes, right? And then when you press run test, all this data gets sent at once, right, to the back end. And then from there, I just have to figure out, because with a job file, you can't pass in any arguments except the runtime, from my understanding, right? And what I want to do, and just to show you like a little bit of pseudocode, so what I would like to do is say like for test in tests, right? And let's just say we're using this output right here. Do something like this. I would say, run, and then the test script would be, I said it was pseudocode, but it's turning into, so you kind of get what I'm saying, right? So we would basically say, okay, for each test, we would run these tests. We would run the test script for each test, and then we would feed in the data file, right? So you'd have to peel in the data file. Obviously, throwing it in a for loop may not be the best thing to do. And so I wouldn't necessarily say, yep, that's what I want to do. But you kind of, I hope that helps provide the point of, I want to run a test script for every test that's listed here. And altogether, so let's say in this case, there'd be 3 test scripts. Altogether, it would be ran under this one job file. And then this job file would then write, this one job file would then write all the results to the database as one like test. From the user perspective, it's just one test. But as you saw with all the lingo that I just went through, technically it's a job. Or populate the data file. I mean, does it make sense to include a BGP nested data file if you aren't doing any BGP testing? Maybe I'm not asking the right question. Does it make sense to include a BGP nested data file if you aren't doing, okay, so if you're not doing BGP routing, then you're not going to include that data file, right? So I guess going back to this drawing here, the data file will only be included if the test script is there. These data files will be loaded on demand. Once again, still trying to figure that piece out, because basically we're creating a YAML file to represent the data file. So yeah, still trying to figure that piece out. And they're throwaway data files, realistically, because what we'll do, we'll take in the inputs from the front end, we'll generate the data files, attach it to the job run or the test script run. We'll get the results from them, and then we'll delete the data file. Now, what I may do is those parameters that we get from the user, we may somehow store it in our database, so that way if you wanted to query, say, okay, well, what did I put in as my parameters for this specific test, that it's available to the user. Yeah. So, like I said, it's doing a little more research on EasyPy and how the jobs are ran. I'm still trying to wrap my head around whether I want it to be one job file with individual test scripts, and maybe I'll just put this down here as an or. I will say black. So now that since we're on the topic now, right? So instead of just doing, so this is option 1, and maybe I'll just draw that. We'll just say this is option 1. Holy crap. We'll say this is option 1. Option 2 down here is we have one job, right? We still have our job file. And then what we have is one test script. I don't like the way that looks. Hold on. So we have one test script, right? So we have one job file, one test script. The test script has test cases, right? So you remember and I'll just reuse this and we'll call it large. So we have common setup. We have common cleanup. And all these test scripts have this set up for the test cases. What I'll do is just call them test cases. All right. And then from here, what we would do is have a test script, or I'm sorry, a test case for each one of these environments, right? So we would do this one. We have this one. And lastly, the OSPF, right? That looks ugly. Let me move. Here we go. I have an idea. There we go. All right, so now we have a test case for each one of these. So hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, I'll try to, put something in the chat and I can try to explain it the best I can. So we have the custom job file with the test script that has common setup, test cases, and a common cleanup, right? And then the test cases then have statically would have it set to where all of these available test cases, right? Each one of these are available within the test script. But the only way they are ran is by using groups. And we didn't really talk about this too much. But if you go to data file inputs, usages and behavior, groups. So I didn't really talk about this too much. So you can basically group test cases. And what this does is allow you to filter out what test cases you want to run. Let me see if I can find flow control. Run IDs, test case grouping. So what we could do, right, is we would have all these test cases and they would all be configured in one test script. So like what we're doing here, where we're saying, okay, let's loop through the tests that the user wants and only run those specific test scripts. What we're doing now is saying, no, we have one test script. It has all the potential test cases that the user would want to run. And what we'll do is we'll use test case grouping to basically say, okay, what is associated to what the user wants. Okay, so we're looking for only the particular use case or test cases that the user wants, and we'll be using it by the group name or by grouping, right? So here's a good example of something you would run for. It says like non-traffic sanities is the group, and you only return test cases that have the tag sanity in its group, and traffic is not in its group name, right? So it would only run the test cases that are grouped or assigned that group ID. And so what that might look like when you run going back to the whole EasyPy documentation, or like the way you run an EasyPy script, is using the name of the test script, which if you remember back here, we only have one test script, so that name would be static. And then we would feed in, we would say, okay, only get these specific groups, right? And so we could possibly filter on that. And the way we could assign them groups is by their use case name, right? So in this case, we would say we only want the test cases that are related to routing and BGP, right? Or we only want test cases related to routing and OSPF because that's what the user selected. And then on top of that, here are the different parameters that the user wants. And all of that, the groups, the parameters, all of that can be put into that data file that we talked about. And just to show you what that looks like, going down to here, right? So let's go to the test cases section, right? So this is that data file, that YAML document. So test cases, the name of the test case, obviously you have to fill it in. And then here's groups. So we could create test cases. We could create test cases for almost anything, right? And give it different groups. So like if we wanted to check something with routing, right? Any test case that relates to routing, regardless of protocol, we would give it the routing group ID. And then we could, then if it was related to BGP, we would put a BGP group ID on it, right? Because you can remember, it's just a list. It's just a list of IDs. And then whenever we run it, we could say, hey, we only want these specific group IDs or groups involved in the test. It may require us to rename some of it because we wouldn't be able to keep it very wide open like this. We probably would have to slim down the specific test case. But I think that could be a potential way to start as well. So, I don't know. I still got to... In my thing, too, if we did it this way, right, where we started assigning groups to the different test cases, what we could do is you could literally start creating test cases and make a directory of test cases and say, almost search the different test cases available to the NetCheck user, right? So you would have a directory and you would say, you know what, I would like to see the tests available for BGP, or I'd like the tests available to OSPF, right? And then you would, you could search by the group ID or whatever. So, yeah. I will say pyATS does have something relative to that now. Let me see if I can find it. I think it's actually... I think it's under the Genie docs. Genie. Verifications. Right, so let's type in BGP. You can do, like here, for example, verify all BGP neighbors. Parser for show BGP all neighbors. Right. So basically what you do is you use the verify BGP all neighbors. What are these called? Verifications. And what it will do for you in the background is, oh, sorry. For iOS XE, it will run all these different commands for you. And then it will take all that data and put it into this schema. And then that way you know what the final schema looks like. And this is more for the development side, not necessarily the that user perspective. But I'm thinking test cases maybe the second option here will be the way to go. Only because, like I said, the only reason I find it to be particular with this is because you can use your group IDs, but I got to play around with the groups a little bit, because if you go overboard, then it turns into like management chaos. And this is a little cleaner too, because you can create test scripts for each different test type and then feed it custom data files. I think the only issue with that is creating, I think Nick brought it up, creating that custom data file and knowing what specific test case to manipulate. So I got to figure that piece out. But as you can see, we did organize, for the most part, we did organize the different tests and the different test cases, right? The different ways that we could do it. So I actually may save this. This actually may help me in the future. And then we'll have, I guess I'll put that here. So we have one data file, plus. So we have different data files for the different test scripts up here, but for the ones down here, it's just one data file, right? So it's kind of two different ways to view it. And this helps as well, because in the data file, we can create that custom YAML file and say, hey, we only need these test cases to run. So I have to do a little more digging on that piece, but yeah, it's a pretty cool, pretty neat graphic. I think I'll save it. But yeah, I'm gonna dig through some options. I gotta test some things out, because this, I could see option 2, I could see getting in the way of like creating chaos. But option 1, on the other hand, I could see being close to impossible unless we used like some sort of key data store to basically say, okay, these are the lists these are the different tests I want to run, and then let's call on those different test scripts. And then on top of it, we have to create data files for those individual test scripts. And we have to know the name of the test cases. And so I'm sure there's an easier way that we can pair that, though. We don't have to run them individually or basically create throwaway data files every time. We should be able to figure it out from there. I guess one last thing, or I think, before we end the stream, I want to go through and create, I'll create a couple of different test scripts. So regardless, I want to make sure everyone kind of sees where we're going. So let me get out of here. All right, so we'll start with, let's do environment. I think environment might be the play. So I like to use, this is verify switch basics. There we go. So you can always start off with this. Let me just copy this over here. And I'll kind of explain it. I'm not just going to copy and paste and say, yeah, here you go. So here's your common setup. And like I said, I personally really only use this section to connect to different devices. So I actually have a little bit of a hack in this where the device that the user plugs in. So in the inventory here, or I'm sorry, in the validation, we plug in a host name, IP, whatever. I give it an alias whenever we create the testbed file. I give it an alias of UUT, and that's straight from the pyATS documentation. It stands for unit under testing. And so I always know that no matter what the host name or the IP is, it always has an alias of UUT. So that's kind of my unique identifier, right? And so I assign this device to this device variable name, which actually will become a device object in the pyATS world. I don't think this is needed, but back whenever I created this, I basically added it as a test script parameter. So I said, anytime you reference device, you're going to reference this device object. So I don't know if it's needed, but I'd have to double check. And then all I did was create a step, which we didn't get into it, and we're not going to get into it, but basically think of it as like another section, right? So we have a subsection here, and then under the subsection, you can create steps within a subsection or within a test, which are like obviously individual steps within that test. However, if one of the steps failed, let's say I had like 10 steps within one test, if one of them failed, it rolled up and basically that whole test failed. But in this case, we only have one step, and it's just to connect to the device. If you wonder why it looks very very readable, I guess, it's because this device variable is, like I said, it's a pyATS device object. And if you don't know what that is, like I said, check out the documentation, and you'll know like the device object has a connect method. So, does SSH connects to the device. All the connection and credentials are defined in the test bed. And I think I still have a test bed. Yeah. So here's a perfect example, right? So this is the DevNet always on sandbox. You can see here we have the CLI, how to connect to the device, use SSH, port 22, the credentials, username, password. You can encrypt this. You can use environment variables. Obviously, it's plain text for now because I'm only using the DevNet always on sandbox. And honestly, I think this is because I do use environment variables in this section now. I think this was just an old prototype. But you can see that alias UUT. So I can always call it upon its alias. I don't have to call it on its host name or IP because that always changes. And that should do it because at this point the common cleanup is done. We're just saying, hey, if the device.connect, I'm surprised. Okay, here we go. So now we create our test script. So in this case, what I'll call it is, we'll call it check environment. And then you have to, this has to subclass from AE test case. So you name the class whatever you want, and this is your test case name. And then you inherit from test case. And I'm sorry, I keep going off script here. So this next portion here is, I call it a setup, but it really isn't a setup. I guess it is. Yeah, we'll go with that. Basically, all we say is, hey, is the device connected? Is it in a connected state? If it is, then we'll pass this test, and we'll just say successfully connected to the device. Else, we'll say it failed and we're not connected to the device. This is always just a good kind of a check to make sure that between the milliseconds between this step, the common setup, and the check environment test case, it's always good just to make sure you're still connected to the device before you run commands on it. Like I said, we'll take a look at. So we're not going to call this the verify test here. So we called the setup, right? We validated that we're connected to the device, and then verify. We'll call verify device basics. I think that might be a good test case name, right? Or I'm sorry, just test name, because our test case is check environment. So it's already assumed that we're checking the environment. So maybe not verify device basics. What we'll do is say verify CPU memory, right? Because that's what we're doing in this step. So the test name. There's a lot of like vocabulary. So if I lose you, I apologize. I try to slow down and explain things as I go. So we have our test case. Then we have our test name, which in this case we're calling it verify CPU memory. And then within the test we have steps, and that's where, like I said, it's like the smallest unit of testing. If any of these steps fail, then the test itself fails, right? That roll-up effect. Oh, hey, Liam. How are you doing? Sorry, I don't know if you said that a few minutes ago. I haven't checked the chat, so thanks for stopping by, Liam. So where was I? Oh yeah, steps. So we're checking the CPU utilization in this step. We have everything in the try and accept block just in case something doesn't work, because right here we're actually connecting to the device and getting the CPU load. And we're basically saying, okay, if the CPU utilization is less than 75, which, take that as the percentage, then we're good. It's under 75%. Else it fails, right? So this is where we could feed in, right? Instead of saying, okay, it has to be less than 75, this is where we could feed in that variable. We can feed in expected CPU, and we would get that from that data file, right? So I think that's what's pretty cool about it, especially with the data files, is you can dynamically change this number. Right now it's just hard coded, but we'll come back through and change it once we load in that variable, or that data file, I'm sorry. All good, man. Nick says, so it's atomic testing. I'm not sure what you mean by atomic testing. As far as it goes through and does it kind of in one swoop. I mean, if it passes, or I think you're talking about the roll-up, the results. So if you're interested in that, Nick, I would suggest taking a look at section results. So under pyATS, the AE test infrastructure section, go to section results. And this will explain how the results are rolled up. I believe it's this one. Interaction results. Result counting, section steps. I believe it's in section results is the roll-up. If one test fails, the whole thing fails. No. I'm sorry. And that's kind of where, let me see if I can find the doc, and I'll just put it in the chat here. Roll up, I think. Results roll-ups. Perfect. All right, so here's the roll-up results, the results object, right? So I'll throw this in the chat. And then if you're interested on how it rolls up, you have to go to, I think, section steps. or section results. I think section results. Yeah, section results explains it. But to answer your question, Nick, no, it goes by. It really it depends on where we're at. So I'll just use the code as an example, right? So if this fails, self.pass, self.failed, if we use self.pass, then we're saying that basically this section passed. Self.failed, however, will fail the entire test case. Because remember, it goes back to, object-oriented programming. And with a class, if you're calling on self, you're basically calling for the entire section, right? And the reason I'm pointing out self specifically is because once you jump into the test, you see step.passed and step.failed. And so this context manager right here basically shows, okay, well, if this step fails, that's fine. We'll go to the next step. Where it becomes interesting is when we catch exceptions, and I'm really bad with this. I need to actually dig down, and right now it's catching any exception, like no matter what it is, and it's just saying self.failed. So basically when it finds an exception, it fails the test, and then moves on, right? So no matter what, that would fail the test. Yeah, I'm sorry. Like, I would love to try to explain it, but there's so many gotchas, there's a roll-up effect, right? And hopefully that document I pass along will help you with that. But yeah, there's a roll-up effect of if a step fails or if a test fails, what passes, what fails. All right. So we have our test, and then our individual steps, CPU and memory. And then trying to think what's next. Let me double check here. Oh, the iOS version. I don't think that's environment. The only other thing to maybe add, or what we could add down here, and I'll add a to-do real quick. To do add tests for checking power supplies, and that's TBD as far as how we're going to check the power supplies, but I think that would be another good test to have. And actually I'll just we'll do verify power self steps and device. For right now, we'll just pass. And we'll just say self.pass. Or no, we're not even going to pass it. We're just going to say pass. But so we'll create a test, and maybe that's what we'll do next time, along with I'll have a more solid plan. I'll have a more solid plan of how we want to configure, going back to the design. Hopefully, if we go the route of creating test scripts for every different test type, right, from the front end, we'll have one of them pretty much knocked out. We'll just have to add this additional test. One last thing before we call it is doing a cleanup. And so, as I mentioned, common cleanup, common setup are two different sections that are required. So in ours, all I'm doing is just disconnecting from the device. And so, simple enough. And device.disconnect. So that's about it. So altogether, we have this is technically a test script. And so, yeah, we have a setup. We have our test case, checking the environment, doing the setup, seeing if the device is connected. Verifying CPU and memory is one test, and then verifying power is another test, is still TBD. Still need to actually configure that piece. We'll do that next time. And then the common cleanup is, in this case, we're just disconnecting from the device. All right, a couple chats here. Nick says, what kind of time are you looking at for it to run validations? Gonna do time-based tests or no? You mean as far as like over a certain time period? No, so these tests will run in like basically at the time the user wants to check the network or clicks run test, it will check it at that moment in time. It won't be like over a certain time span. These are going to be individual tests, or what if you made changes to say 20 branch routers? Can you do bulk testing? Yes. So this is where, and this is still like me trying to figure things out. If we go to inventory, right, so you can type in, a router name, device name. My thought is you take custom validation and you put like devices that you want to test, and you can do, have you ever seen like, what is it, multi-select text box, I think? Let me see if this is it. I'm just trying to show an example. Hopefully this is it. No, that's not it. Multi-choice text box. How can I add a text box? No. All right, so it's tough to find. But basically when you start typing, it would say like, okay, what devices you want, and you would select a device and it would pop up as like a its own individual icon, and then have a little X next to it if you wanted to take it out of the list. And you could create a list, which essentially would be your test bed, and then you would run against your test bed all these checks. So these are going to be individual tests. Oh, I already answered that one. Or does it iterate one at a time? As far as running over the test bed, it would be, I gotta double check the way pyATS does it, but I'm pretty sure it's serial over each device. But I have to double check. I don't actually, come to think of it, I don't know for a fact, so I can't answer that. No, I mean, if a test doesn't complete in 5 seconds or a minute or whatever you think is best. Oh, there is a timeout. Yes. Testing for timeouts. Yeah. So that'll be caught as an exception. Yeah. So there will be a timeout. I have to double check what it is though. So because I'm sure that's gonna be your follow up of, okay, cool, but what is it? I don't know. I have to double check. So, but all right. Any other questions? Anyone else out there that wants to chat? I see, unless I'm reading this wrong, it looks like there's 12 viewers right now. That's a good amount. It's probably one of the most viewers I've had for ever. So if anyone's out there, thanks for stopping by. Hopefully you learned a little bit about pyATS and some of the structure. Like I said, it's a crash course. And if you want to learn more, feel free to could rewatch this, or messaging me on Twitter is probably the best way to get a hold of me directly. If you don't know, it's just at DevNetDan. I think that's, but I'm sure there's a lot of you watching that probably do know, just based on my bio and stuff like that. So, cool. Congrats on a good amount of viewers on your stream. Thanks. Yeah, Nick, I'm actually looking at the chart here. It's like, it definitely took off. Like, it looks like it peaked around like 20 viewers, it looks like. But yeah, wow, that's awesome. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Yeah, this is crazy. So, all right, well, I think that's it for me. Like I said, we did accomplish what we came here for, kind of. We have two options now. So I'm going to kind of go through these options. If there's anyone from the pyATS development team that watches this, feel free to message me. If you're looking at these options and you're like, hey, this one's not going to work because of X, Y, and Z, that would be awesome, because that's a clear-cut answer. But I'm going to test each option out, hopefully over the next week, and then no matter what, I'll have a choice selected by next stream, so that way we can actually get started working on the back end. And basically, for kind of like upcoming streams, I'm gonna get the back end working and solidified before I work on the front end, because like I said, the front end is not my specialty. I got this working through Stack Overflow and just looking some things up and reading through. There's a JavaScript implementation called Sortable.js, and which helped me do the drag and drop features. But I gotta dive in a little more to the front end stuff and prepare a little more, because it's just not my forte. So yeah, well, if that's it, no more questions. Thank you all for tuning in. And like I said, I mean, I'm just blown away by the amount of people that stopped by tonight. It looks like actually we got close to 500 views, so, which is ridiculous. So thank you all. Yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to message me at DevNetDan on Twitter. That's the best way to get a hold of me. Oh, sorry, one more question. Brute force front end. F it, we're doing it live. Yeah. I mean, Nick, the front end, besides brute forcing it, it's like one of like, I don't love doing it either. So if there's anyone out there, this is, I guess, my call to service. If anyone out there likes doing front end stuff, please feel free to message me, or contribute, or take a look at my code. Obviously it's all on GitHub. So yeah, feel free to help me out with the front end stuff. I can tell you what I'm looking for, but yeah, I'm not good with the front end stuff. So any help is much appreciated. So, all right. Well, yeah, we just passed over 500 views for the stream. So wow, this is amazing. So thank you all for tuning in, and I will be back next Thursday. Have a good night, everyone.
Hold me close till I get up. Time is barely on our side. I don't wanna waste what's left. The storms we chase are leading us, and love is all we'll ever trust. Yeah, no, I don't wanna waste what's left. And on we'll go, through the wastelands, through the highways, till my shadow turns to sun rays. And on